Title: Sennacherib versus Hezekiah. Two Kings, Two Legacies. 1. Night picture. The hills around Jerusalem in the year 701 before Christ. Every ridge, every terrace, every olive grove as far as you can see is covered with tents, chariots, and men. This is the army of Assyria, and it has just finished doing something almost no army in the ancient world could do. It has swallowed 46 fortified cities of Judah, one after another, the way a python works its way down a row of eggs. You are standing on the wall of Jerusalem. Below you, you can hear the creak of siege machines being wheeled into place. You can smell smoke from the camps spread across the valley. And somewhere out there, in a tent bigger than most houses, sits a king who believes, without one flicker of doubt, that this city will fall before the week is out. His name is Sennacherib, king of Assyria, son of the great Sargon II, ruler of an empire that stretches from the mountains of what is now Iran all the way to the border of Egypt. And inside the walls, in the palace, sits another king. His name is Hezekiah. He has already paid Sennacherib a fortune in silver and gold. Gold he stripped off the very doors of the temple of the Lord with his own hands. And it was not enough. Two kings, one night that is coming, and two records of what happened, written by two very different hands. One of those records is carved into a six-sided block of baked clay, about the size of a large pineapple. You can walk up and look at it today in the British Museum. It is called the Taylor Prism, and on it, Sennacherib boasts, in detail, about shutting Hezekiah up inside Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. The other record is a scroll, and it says that on a single night, something walked through the Assyrian camp, and by morning 185,000 men were dead. Here's what most people miss. Read both records side by side, and one of them has a strange silence in it, a sentence that should be there and isn't. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what that missing sentence is and why a king who had never lost a war went home and never came back. This is not a story about which army was bigger. This is not a story about ancient politics. This is not a story about clay tablets sitting behind glass in a museum case. This is a story about what two men did in the dark on the same night, with everything on the line, and only one of them was still alive a few weeks later. To understand why everyone in Jerusalem was so terrified, you have to understand what Sennacherib's name meant by this point. His capital city, Nineveh, was being rebuilt on a scale nobody in the region had ever seen. Walls so wide that, according to later writers, 3 chariots could drive along the top of them side by side. His armies had marched through Babylon, through Phoenicia, through kingdom after kingdom along the coast, and every single one of them had eventually surrendered, paid up, or been destroyed. By the time his army reached Judah, you weren't looking at a rumor of a threat. You were looking at a track record. 46 cities, 0 exceptions. And now, it was Jerusalem's turn. Let's go back a few months to understand how we got here. Sennacherib did not start with Jerusalem. He started with Lachish, the second most important city in Judah, a fortress on a hill with walls thick enough, its people thought, to stop anything. If you want to know what Sennacherib did to Lachish, you don't have to guess. He had it carved into the walls of his own palace in Nineveh. Today, those carvings, known as the Lachish reliefs, sit in the British Museum, and they are some of the most detailed battle scenes that survive from the entire ancient world. You can see siege ramps built of earth and timber, climbing toward the walls. You can see archers and slingers behind tall wicker shields. You can see battering rams with iron-tipped points shaped like spears grinding against the gates, and you can see prisoners being led away, some of them impaled on poles outside the city, as a warning to anyone who might think about resisting. Lachish fell, and Sennacherib made very sure that everyone in Judah heard exactly how it fell. Word reached Jerusalem fast, and Hezekiah, a king who had spent years tearing down altars to foreign gods, a king who had even destroyed the bronze serpent that Moses made centuries earlier in the wilderness, because the people of Judah had started burning incense to a piece of bronze instead of to the God who delivered them. That same king panicked. He sent messengers to Sennacherib's camp with a message: "I have done wrong. Withdraw from me and I will pay whatever you demand." Sennacherib named his price, 300 talents of silver, 30 talents of gold. To put that in terms you can feel, that gold alone weighed more than a small car. Hezekiah paid it. He emptied the treasuries of the temple and the palace, and when that wasn't enough, he did something that must have felt like tearing a piece of skin off his own body. He stripped the gold off the doors and doorposts of the temple, doors he himself had overlaid with gold as an act of devotion, and sent it to the king of Assyria. And it didn't work. Sennacherib took the silver. He took the gold, and he kept marching toward Jerusalem anyway. Try to picture what daily life looked like inside Jerusalem during those weeks. You would have woken up to the sound of Assyrian work crews in the distance, building ramps and platforms, slow and steady, like a countdown you could actually hear. Food was being rationed. Water was being carefully measured out from cisterns, because Hezekiah had already cut off the springs outside the wall, which protected the city, but also meant every drop inside now mattered. Refugees from the smaller towns Sennacherib had already destroyed were crowded into Jerusalem's streets, telling anyone who would listen exactly what they had seen. If you lived in that city, you didn't need anyone to describe what was coming. You had eyewitnesses. Here's the part nobody tells you. While all of this was happening, Hezekiah was also doing something remarkable. He gathered his officers and his commanders together in a public square in Jerusalem, where everyone could hear, and he said something that has been quoted for almost 3,000 years. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged because of the king of Assyria and the vast army with him. For there is a greater power with us than with him. With him is only the arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God, to help us and to fight our battles. Then he got to work. He blocked up the springs outside the city, so the Assyrian army would arrive to find no water for miles. He repaired the broken sections of Jerusalem's wall and built a second wall outside it. He had weapons and shields made in large numbers, and he put commanders over the people. In other words, Hezekiah prayed like everything depended on God and worked like everything depended on him. The people, the text says, relied on what he told them, but none of it, not the walls, not the weapons, not the blocked springs, was going to be enough for what was coming. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Hezekiah probably already knew it. So here's where we are. Sennacherib has swallowed 46 cities. He has been paid off with everything Hezekiah owns, and he is still coming. If you're finding this story compelling, the kind of history that turns out to be more than just history, go ahead and subscribe now, because there's a detail coming up in a few minutes that connects directly back to that missing sentence on the Taylor Prism. You will not want to miss it. Because right now, Sennacherib sends his second wave. Not soldiers this time, words. And the man he sends is about to stand outside the wall of Jerusalem and say something so insulting that the king's own officials beg him to stop. Now imagine you are one of those ordinary people, standing on the wall, doing exactly what you've been told, guarding your section, saying nothing, watching the road. And then you see 3 figures walking out from the Assyrian lines toward the wall, unarmed, alone. For a moment, you might even feel a flicker of relief. Maybe this is a peace delegation. Maybe this is over. His title is the Rabshakeh, an Assyrian military rank, something close to chief field commander. He comes to the wall of Jerusalem with 2 other officers, and he asks for someone to come out and talk. 3 men from Hezekiah's staff go out to meet him. One of them is Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, the palace administrator, essentially the prime minister of Judah. And the Rabshakeh starts talking in Hebrew, loudly. On purpose, he mocks Hezekiah's trust in Egypt, calling Egypt a splintered reed that will pierce the hand of anyone foolish enough to lean on it. He mocks Hezekiah's trust in the Lord, pointing out, correctly, that Hezekiah had just torn down altars and shrines all over the country, and asking whether the God who had been insulted by that would really show up to help now. And then he says something that must have landed like a slap across the face. He claims that the Lord himself sent him to destroy Jerusalem. Eliakim and the other officials beg him, please, speak to us in Aramaic, the language of diplomats, not in Hebrew, the language of the people standing on the wall. They don't want the ordinary citizens of Jerusalem, the bakers, the farmers, the soldiers on guard duty, to hear any of this. The Rabshakeh's answer is the cruelest part. He raises his voice even louder, and in Hebrew, he tells the people on the wall that they are doomed to eat their own waste and drink their own urine alongside everyone else under siege, and that no God of any nation, anywhere, has ever rescued its people from the king of Assyria. So why would Judah's God be any different? And here is what the text tells us about the people on the wall. They said nothing, not one word, because the king had given a command, do not answer him. And this is where it gets remarkable. When Hezekiah hears all of this, he does not call an emergency meeting of his generals. He does not send back a counter threat. He tears his clothes, the way people in that culture tore their clothes for death, for grief, for news so bad there were no words for it. And he covers himself in sackcloth, and he walks into the temple of the Lord. At the same time, he sends Eliakim and the other officials, also wearing sackcloth, to the prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz. By this point in his life, Isaiah was not a young man delivering his first prophecy. He had been telling king after king hard truths for years. Truths that weren't always popular in an era when prophets who said the wrong thing to the wrong king sometimes paid for it with their lives. If you had been one of those officials walking to Isaiah's door that day, you would have known exactly how much was riding on whatever he said next. Their message is short, and it might be one of the most honest sentences in the whole Bible. This is a day of distress, of rebuke, and of disgrace. Children have come to the moment of birth, and there is no strength left to deliver them. If you have ever felt that something terrible is coming, and you have absolutely no power to stop it, that sentence was written for you almost 3,000 years before you were born. There's a Hebrew word that shows up again and again in this part of the story. It's the word yareh. It usually gets translated simply as fear, but it means something deeper than being scared. It means standing in front of something so much bigger than you that your knees actually shake. Whether that something is an enemy or whether it's God himself. And the whole point of this story is a contest between 2 kinds of yareh. The fear Assyria is trying to plant in Jerusalem, and the fear, the awe, that Hezekiah still has left for his God. Notice what Hezekiah does not do. He does not pretend he isn't afraid. He does not put on a brave face for his officials and act like everything is fine. He tears his clothes. He puts on the clothing of grief in public, where everyone can see. If you have ever felt like admitting how scared you are would prove you don't trust God enough, this story says the opposite is true. You are allowed to be afraid, and it is precisely into that fear that God speaks next. Isaiah's answer comes back short. He tells the officials not to be afraid of the words they've heard. He says the king of Assyria will hear a rumor, return to his own land, and there fall by the sword. But Sennacherib isn't finished. He sends an actual letter, written, sealed, delivered by hand, repeating the same threats, the same mockery of Israel's God. And Hezekiah does something with that letter you need to picture clearly. He takes it. He walks into the temple, and he spreads it out flat, open, readable, in front of the Lord. And then he prays, out loud, in front of witnesses, a prayer that's still preserved word for word. He asks God to listen, to see, to hear the words Sennacherib sent to insult the living God. And then he asks for one specific thing, that all the kingdoms of the earth would know that the Lord alone is God. Pay attention to this because Isaiah sends back an answer. And buried inside it is a single Hebrew word that's about to matter more than almost anything else in this video. The word is Pele. It means escape or remnant, the part that survives when everything else is gone. Isaiah tells Hezekiah that out of Jerusalem will come a remnant, a Pele, that will take root downward and bear fruit upward. In other words, something is going to survive tonight. Hold that thought. Now watch what happens next. That night, the text says, the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 men in the camp of the Assyrians. The Hebrew word for that messenger is malach, the same word used for the being that appeared to Mary, to Joseph, to shepherds in a field centuries later. And when the people of Jerusalem got up the next morning, there were only dead bodies. No battle, no siege engines breaking through the gates, no final assault. Sennacherib struck camp and went home to Nineveh, and he never came back to Jerusalem again. And here is where we go back to that missing sentence. Sennacherib's own scribes carved his military record onto the Taylor Prism in incredible detail. He lists city after city he destroyed. He lists kings he humiliated. He says he shut Hezekiah up in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. And then, nothing. No claim of victory over the city itself. No claim that he captured it, looted it, or burned it. The things he did to literally every other major city he names in that same document. For a king who bragged about everything, that silence is deafening. It gets stranger. Centuries later, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote down a story he picked up in Egypt, a tale about field mice swarming an Assyrian camp overnight, gnawing through bowstrings and shield straps, leaving the soldiers helpless by morning. Most historians think this is an old folk memory of the very same disaster, reshaped over hundreds of years into a story about mice instead of an angel. Two completely different cultures, centuries apart, both remembering that something happened in that camp in the dark, something sudden, something total, and something no army could explain. And Sennacherib himself? He went home to Nineveh and lived for another 20 years, building palaces, fighting other wars, and never once setting foot near Jerusalem again. Then one day, while he was bowing down in the temple of his god Nisroch, his own sons, Adramelech and Sharezer, struck him down with the sword and escaped to the land of Ararat. Think about that for a second. The man who mocked the God of Israel for not protecting his people was murdered by his own children in his own temple, in front of his own God, who did nothing. This is not a story that ends with Sennacherib losing a battle. This is not a story that ends with Jerusalem celebrating a military triumph. This is not even really a story about Assyria at all. This is a story about what happens when a king with nothing left runs out of options at the exact same moment as a king with everything runs out of time. Now, here's something worth sitting with, because this isn't just ancient history. Maybe you've had a night like that, not with armies camped outside your door, but with something that felt just as overwhelming. A diagnosis you weren't ready for, a bill you can't pay, a relationship falling apart while you lie awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, with absolutely nothing left you can do about it tonight. You've run out of silver. You've run out of gold. You've run out of arguments. Hezekiah didn't have an army big enough. He didn't have a strategy clever enough. What he had was a letter, and a temple and a willingness to spread the problem out in front of God instead of carrying it alone in the dark. That's it. That's the whole move. You don't get to choose whether a Sennacherib shows up in your life. You don't get to choose the timing, and you usually don't get a say in how loud the mockery gets before it's over. But you do get to choose what you do with the letter, whether you carry it alone or whether you spread it out somewhere and say it out loud. So here's what this story leaves you with. 3 things. First, the facts. Sennacherib's own monument, the one he built to brag about his greatness, contains a silence where his greatest victory should be. The thing he could not do is written into the thing he built to prove he could do anything. Second, what it means for you. The loudest voice in the room, the one mocking you, the one telling you that no one has ever come through for someone like you, that this time is different, that this time you're alone. That voice has been wrong before. It was wrong outside the walls of Jerusalem, and the people who said nothing back, who simply waited, were still standing the next morning. And third, and this is the one I want you to actually sit with, Hezekiah was not a perfect king. He had already failed once, paying off an enemy that was never going to be satisfied. But God did not wait for Hezekiah to become perfect before showing up. He showed up in the middle of Hezekiah's fear, in the middle of the Yare, not after it was gone. Which part of this story hit you the hardest? The silence on the prism, the letter spread out in the temple, or what happened to Sennacherib's own family? Tell me in the comments below. Every single one of us is writing some kind of record with our lives, something that will outlast us, the way that Prism has outlasted Sennacherib by nearly 27 centuries. The question this story leaves you with isn't whether you'll face a night like that. At some point, you will. The question is what gets remembered afterward, the silence where the victory should have been, or the prayer that got answered in the dark. 2 kings, 1 night, and only one record that's still being read 3,000 years later. Not carved in clay to brag, but written down to be remembered.